Hello, I'm Mike McDougall. I am reading The Emperor's Messenger, originally published in Life, a User's Manual by George Perec. Carlin van Lourens was one of the oddest minds of his time. He was born in Holland, but had himself naturalized French out of love for the philosophies. He lived in Persia, Arabia, China, and the two Americas. He spoke a dozen or more languages fluently. With his obviously outstanding but dissipated mind, which he seemed unable to devote to any single discipline for more than a couple of years, he undertook in the course of his life wildly different activities, practicing as a surgeon just as happily and speedily as he did a surveyor, setting up in Langor a cannon foundry, founding in Shiraz a veterinary school, teaching physiology at Bologna, mathematics at Hall, and astronomy at Barcelona, where he dared put forward the hypothesis that McCain had made an error in calculating the length of the meter. Smuggling guns for Wolfe Tone, or, as an organ builder, imagining how to replace the coupler registers by lever switches, as would in fact be done a century later. As a result of this systematic versatility, in the course of his life, Carl van Lourens came to ask himself several interesting questions and got started several times on provisional answers, which were lacking neither in elegance nor even on occasion in brilliance, but almost every time he failed to write up his results. In a remotely comprehensible manner, after his death, mostly indecipherable notes were found in his study, dealing variously with archaeology, Egyptology, typography, plan for universal alphabet, linguistics, letter to Humboldt on the language of the Oracenis. It was obviously only a draft in case Humboldt doesn't mention it. Medicine, politics, draft for a democratic regime taking account of the separation not only of the three powers of legislation, the executive, and the judiciary, but with disquieting foresight, a fourth power also, which he dubbed publicitary, from Publicist Journal. In other words, the power of information, numerical algebra, note on Goldbach's problem, proposing that any number n be the sum of k primes, physiology, hypothesis concerning the hibernation of marmots, the pneumatic body of birds, the voluntary breath holding of hippopotami, etc., optics, physics, chemistry, a critique of Lavoisier's theories of acids, draft classification of the elements, together with several ideas for inventions, in most cases falling short of full development by very little. A steerable hobby horse, similar to the dressane, but 20 years earlier, a material he baptized paletet, a kind of artificial leather composed of a strong canvas base coated with a mixture of powdered cork, linseed oil, glues, and resins, or a solar forge made of an assembly of metal plates polished like mirrors, focused convergently on a hearth point. End paragraph. In 1805, Carlin van Lourens sought money to finance an expedition to find the source or sources of the Nile, a project many had thought of, but which no one had been able to carry out before then. He returned to Napoleon I, whom he had already met a few years before, when, as a general too popular by half for the taste of the Directorate, who sent him to Egypt in order to keep him well away, the future emperor of the French had garnered around him some of the best scholars of his time to accompany him on the campaign. Napoleon had set himself a difficult diplomatic problem. The largest part of the French navy had just been sunk at Trafalgar, and, anxious to find a means of stemming the formidable maritime homogeny of the British, the emperor thought of hiring the services of the most famous of the Barbary corsairs, the one they called Hokam el Ulak, the eagle of the instant. Hokam el Ulak commanded a veritable fleet of 11 galleons whose perfectly coordinated actions made him the master of a good portion of the Mediterranean. But though he had no reason to love the British, whom had held Gibraltar for nearly 100 years and Malta for 5, and thus had increasingly threatened the activities of the Barbary corsairs, he had no reason to like the French any better, since they, like the Spaniards, the Dutch, the Genoese, and the Venetians, had never thought twice before shelling Algiers. In any case, the first problem was to contact the Eagle, since, in his concern to protect himself from assassination, he had himself permanently escorted by 18 deaf-mute bodyguards whose sole standing order was to kill anyone coming within 3 paces of their master. So it was when he was wondering where to find the rare bird who could bring off such difficult negotiations, which looked so discouraging at the outset, that the emperor gave an audience to Karel van Lourens, and on receiving him had to say to himself that fortune had once again smiled on him. Van Lourens, he knew, spoke perfect Arabic, and in Egypt he had had occasion to appreciate his intelligence, his quick mind, and his decisiveness, his sense of diplomacy, and his courage. Without hesitation, Napoleon agreed to fund the entire cost of an expedition to the sources of the Nile in return for Lourens undertaking to get a message to Hokeb el Oket in Algiers. A few weeks later, Karel van Lourens metamorphosed into a prosperous merchant from the Parisian Gulf, answering to the respectable name of Hajj Abdulaziz Abu Bakr, made his entry into Algiers at the head of a long procession of camels and an escort composed of 20 of the Imperial Guard's best Mamelukes. He was carrying carpets, guns, pearls, sponges, cloth, and spices, merchandise of the highest quality, for which he quickly found takers, even though Algiers was at the time a wealthy city where you could find produce in profusion from all over the world, diverted from its original destination by pirate raids of the Barbary corsairs. But Lourens kept to himself 3 big iron chests, and to all who asked what was in them, he invariably replied, "None is worthy to see the treasures that these chests hold, if he be not Hokab el Wak." On the 4th day following his arrival, 3 of the Eagle's men came for Lourens at the door of his inn. They signaled him to follow. He acquiesced, and they made him get into a sedan chair, hermetically sealed by thick leather curtains. They took him outside the city to an isolated shrine where they locked him up after a thorough body search. Several hours went by. At last, after nightfall, preceded by some of his bodyguards, Hokab appeared. "I've had your chests opened," he said, and they were empty. "I have come to offer you 4 times as much gold as those chests could ever hold." What need do I have of your gold? The smallest Spanish galleon offers me 7 times as much." "When did you last take your last galleon? The English sink them, and you daren't attack the English. Next to their 3 masters, your galleots are bathtubs. Who sent you? You are the Eagle, and only another eagle may address you. I come to you with a message from Napoleon I, Emperor of the French." Hokeb el Wak must have known who Napoleon was, and no doubt held him in high esteem, since without exactly answering in so many words the proposal he had received, he regarded Karel van Lourens from then on as an ambassador, and insisted on treating him with infinite consideration. He invited him to stay in his palace, an immense fortress overhanging the sea, with terraces of enchanted gardens resplendent with jujube and carob trees, oleanders, and tame gazelles, and he gave sumptuous feasts in his honor, where he made him sample rare dishes from America and Asia. In return for this, Lourens spent whole afternoons telling the Arab of his adventures and describing to him the fabulous cities where he had sojourned. Diomira, the city of 60 silver domes; Isura, the town of 1,000 wells; Smerlindine, the city of water; and Moraine, with its alabaster gates, transparent in the sunlight, its coral columns supporting pediments encrusted with serpentine, its villas all of glass, like aquariums where the shadows of dancing girls with silvery scales swim beneath Medusa-shaped chandeliers. Lourens had been the Eagle's guest for almost a week when, one evening, alone in the garden to which his suite of rooms opened, he was finishing a cup of exquisite mocha and puffing occasionally on the amber mouthpiece of a hookah perfumed with rosewater. He heard a velvety voice sing out in the night, It was an ethereal and melancholy woman's voice, and the tune it sang sounded so familiar to Lawrence that he lent his ear to the music and the words and was hardly surprised to recognize Chaucer's merciless beauty. Sin I fro love escaped am so fat, I never fan to ben in his prison lane. Sin I am free, I count him not a bene. He may answer, and saith this or that. I do no fors, I spec right as I men. Sin I free, I count him not a ben. I never think to ben in his prison land. My best efforts at Old English. Lawrence rose and went forward to the voice, towards the voice, and on the yonder side of a recess in the fortress, vertically above the jagged shoreline rocks, about 10 meters higher than his own apartments, he saw on a balcony, entirely enclosed by gilded mesh and lit up in the dark by the mellow light of tarry torches, a woman of such extraordinary beauty that he threw caution to the winds, jumped astride the balustrade of his balcony, made his way along a narrow ledge to the other side of the fortress, and, using the indentations on the rock face, hauled himself up with his bare hand to the level of the young woman. He called to her softly. She heard him, made as if to run away, then, returning, came closer to him, and in a few breathless whispers told him her baleful tale. Her name was Ursula von Littau, daughter of the Count of Littau, former aide-de-camp to Friedrich Wilhelm II. She was to have been married at the age of 15 to the son of the Spanish ambassador to the Prussian court at Potsdam, Alvesco Sanchez del Estero. The corvette taking her across the sea to her future husband in Malagna had been attacked by the Barbary pirates. She owed it to her beauty alone that she had kept her life, and for 10 years she had languished in the harem of the Eagle of the Instant amongst his 15 other wives. Half hanging in empty space, Karl von Lurens listened to Ursula von Littau with tears in his eyes, and when she had finished her story, he swore to free her the very next day. As a token of his oath, he slipped his signet ring onto her finger, a ring with an ovoid bezel, within which was set an opaline corundum, interrogated with an 8 lying on its side. For the ancients, he told her, this stone was the symbol of memory, and there is a legend that whoever sees this ring once will never again be able to forget. In less than 24 hours, abandoning entirely the mission the emperor had entrusted him with, Lawrence set up the escape of Ursula von Littau. Next day, he obtained the necessary equipment, and in the evening returned to the foot of the harem balcony. Taking a heavy smoke glass vial from one of his pockets, he poured a few drops of the steaming liquid onto several parts of the wire mesh. Under the corrosive force of the acid, the iron bars began to disintegrate, and Lawrence was able to arrange a small opening which would allow the young Prussian woman to slip away. She came towards midnight. It was a black night. Far away, outside the Eagle's suite of rooms, the guards paced nonchalantly up and down. Lawrence unrolled a ladder of knotted silk, which reached to the floor of the fortress, and which Ursula and he then used to descend 90 feet below to a sandy cove surrounded by rocks and reefs breaking the surface of the water. 2 Mamelukes from his escort awaited him on the strand, carrying shaded lanterns. Leading them between the rocks and across the stony landslips beneath the cliff, they guided them to the mouth of a dried-up wadi that went far up into the interior. The rest of the escort waited there. Ursula von Littau was hoisted into an attack, that kind of rounded tent carried by camels, and in which the fairer sex ordinarily ride, and the caravan set off. Lawrence planned on getting to Oran, where the Spanish influence still prevailed, but he didn't have the opportunity to do so. Before daybreak, when they were still only a few hours' ride from Algiers, the Eagle's men caught up with them and attacked. The battle was brief, and from the Mamelukes' point of view, a disaster. Lawrence didn't see much of it, as the shaven head of Hercules knocked him out at the start with a mere blow of his fist. When Karl von Lawrence awoke, aching all over, he found he was in a room that looked like a cell. Flagstones, a bare, dark wall with a built-in iron ring, light came from a small opening equipped with finely crafted wrought iron bars. Lurens went up to it and saw that his prison was part of a tiny village of 3 or 4 shacks around a well, surrounded by a tiny palm grove. The eagle's men were camping out, honing their scimitars, tipping their arrows, and practicing feats of horsemanship. Suddenly the door opened and 3 men appeared. They seized Lurens and took him to a place a few hundred yards from the village, beyond a few dunes, amidst dead palm trees which the desert had claimed back from the oasis, where they strung him to a wooden frame that was halfway between a camp bed and an operating table, with a long leather thong wound several times around his trunk and limbs. Then they went off at a gallop. Night began to fall. Lurens knew that if he didn't die of cold in the night, he would be certainly burnt to death by the sun the next day, as if he had been in the middle of his solar forge. He recalled describing the project to Hokab, and the Arab nodding his head thoughtfully and muttering that the desert sun needed no mirrors, and he reflected that in choosing to have him die by this means of torture, the eagle meant to teach him the meaning of his words. Years later, when he was sure Napoleon could no longer have him arrested and that Rostand could no longer have him killed, as he had sworn to avenge the 20 comrades slaughtered in this escapade, Karl van Lurens wrote a short memorandum of his adventure and sent it to the King of Prussia in the secret hope that His Majesty would grant him a pension in reward for having tried to rescue the daughter of his late father's aide-de-camp. In it he told of how his life was saved by a mere stroke of chance, a chance that had the Eagles men tie him up with a thong of plaited leather. Had they but used estapo or hemp rope or a canvas strip, he would never have been able to get free. But leather, as everyone knows, stretches when saturated with sweat, and after hours of contorted straining, heavy panting, sudden exertions, followed by shudders verging on the throes of death, Lurens felt that the thong, which up until then had dug deeper into his flesh with every effort made, had begun minutely to yield. He was so exhausted that despite the throttling anguish he felt, he dropped into a feverish sleep broken by nightmares in which he saw armies of rats attacking him from all sides and tearing out lumps of living flesh with their long teeth. He woke up panting, bathed in sweat, and felt that he was at last able to move his swollen feet. Within a few hours he had untied himself. The night was icy, and a violent wind whipped up swirls of sand which cut into his skin, badly bruised as it was. With the energy born of despair, Lurens dug a hole in the sand and hid himself as best he could, closing himself in with the heavy wooden frame to which he had been strapped. He couldn't get back to sleep, and for a long time, struggling against the cold and the sand which got into his eyes and mouth and caked the open sores on his wrists and ankles, he tried to think out his position lucidly. It was not promising. To be sure, he could move his legs, and he would doubtless manage to survive this dreadful night, but he was critically weak, without food or water, and he didn't know where he was, apart from being a few hundred yards from an oasis where those who had left him for dead were camping. If that was all so, then he had no chance of surviving. This certainty almost brought him some peace. It meant that his life no longer hung on his courage, intelligence, or strength, but on fate alone. The day broke at last. Lurens extracted himself from his hole, stood up, and managed a few paces. Over the dunes in front of him, the tips of the palm trees could be seen clearly. There did not seem to be any noise coming from the oasis. Lurens felt his hopes rise again. If the Eagle's men, their task done, had left their temporary lair and gone back to Algiers, that meant first, that the coast was near, and second, that he would find food and water at the oasis. This hope gave him the strength to haul himself as far as the palm trees. His reasoning had been wrong, or at the very least purely hypothetical, but it proved correct on one point. The oasis was deserted. The shacks, more than half collapsed, seemed to have been abandoned years ago. The well was dried up and swarming with scorpions. The palm trees were living their last seasons. Lurens rested for a few hours and dressed his wounds with palm fronds. Then he set off northwards. He walked for hours and hours with methodical and hallucinated step across a landscape that was no longer a sandy desert, but had become stony and gray with sparse tufts of almost yellow grass with sharp-edged blades and, now and again, a donkey's carcass, all white and powdery, or a crumbling pile of stones that had perhaps once been a shepherd's hut. Then, when the dusk was coming on once again, he thought he saw, far away, at the very end of a plateau bristling with crevices and lumpy protrusions, camels, goats, and tents. It was a Berber camp. The night was dark when he finally reached it and slumped in front of the fire around which the men of the tribe were seated. He stayed more than a week with them. They only knew a few words of Arabic and so could not communicate much, but they looked after him, repaired his clothes, and, when he left, gave him food, water, and a dagger whose handle was a polished stone girt, with a strip of brass decorated with delicate arabesques. To protect his soles, unused to walking bare on stony ground, they made him a kind of wooden pattern held onto his foot by a broad leather strap, and he took to it so well that afterwards he never went back to European shoes. A few weeks later, Karl van Lourens was safely in Oran. He didn't know what had become of Ursula van Letouw, and his attempts to organize a punitive expedition to free her were in vain. Only in 1816, after the Eagle of the Instant had been killed in the bombardment of Algiers on the 27th of August by an Anglo-Dutch flotilla, was it learnt that the woman from his harem, that the unfortunate Prussian girl had suffered the fate reserved for unfaithful wives. She had been sewn into a leather sack and thrown into the sea from the top of the fortress. Karl van Lourens lived for almost 40 years more. Under the borrowed name of John Ross, he became the governor of Ceuta's librarian and spent the rest of his days transcribing the Cordoban court poets and sticking on the fly leaves of the library books an ex libris depicting an ammoniite fossil beneath the proud motto, Non Frosta Vixi. The end.